community across the globe. During the COVID times, I sincerely hope that your families and you are safe and well. We'd like to welcome you to Global Policy Insights Indian Women in International Relations inaugural webinar series. I'd like to give our attendees perhaps another minute to join in. So just wait for another minute. Great. So while we're waiting for a few more attendees, I'd just simply request all our attendees to ensure they're on mute. And of course, we'd appreciate if you turn off your videos for the time being to ensure that we have maximum bandwidth for our speakers on the session. Great. Well, we do see a lot of attendees joining in, so I think it's definitely great to kick off. So once again, a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Welcome to Global Policy Insights Indian Women in International Relations inaugural webinar series. Today, we're excited to discuss the future of South Asia, avenues for regional diplomacy, and the Indo-China conflict. But before we really begin the discussion, once again, I'd like to wish our speakers, the audience, and the larger Indian community live streaming this session a very happy Independence Day. I'm Jasmine Mehta, and I'm the non-resident fellow at Global Policy Insights, and also a co-chair to the Indian Women in International Relations Initiative and Forum, and will also be a moderator for the panel discussion today. Before we really dwell into the discussions, I'd like to briefly introduce the initiative that we are launching today at Global Policy Insights. Neha Devan, our panelist today, and I, like I said, are extremely thrilled to launch the Indian Women in International Relations Forum, along with our CEO, Arpit Chaturvedi and Silva Mishra, who are also co-chairs to this initiative. To really kind of bring this to light, IWIR is the acronym, is a unique network of Indian women and women of Indian origin with a vision to amplify voices of women in the field of international relations while challenging biases that prevent women, especially women of color, from being recognized as expert voices in the women of, in the international relations and international political economy disciplines. Many women, specifically Indian women, women of the Indian diaspora, which I may like to highlight is the largest diaspora in the world, have established some of the greatest milestones in the history of their disciplines through their research, advocacy, and practice. The IWIR Forum seeks to make a sustained attempt to bring such scholarship and scholars to the very forefront. Finally, IWIR also holds a vision with a call to action. The forum seeks to leverage its network to mentor and provide career guidance to emerging talent among Indian women, both millennials and Gen Z, in the space of geopolitics and policy. I think at this point, I briefly covered IWIR and really our mission and one of the greatest reasons for having this event today. But Neha, is there anything that you'd like to add about this initiative?
Thank you, Jasmine. I think you very eloquently articulated what the IWIR envisions to do. But just to add that today, particularly, that our inaugural series is coinciding with the Indian Independence Day is both historic and symbolic, because we are hoping to really put a new threshold for the equality movement and a movement for equal representation in the field of international relations. And for this day, I'm very pleased, therefore, to have Professor Raja Mohan, Professor Veena, Ravi, Kumar, and Ms. Suhasini Heather, who will also be joining us shortly as the inaugural panelists. pretty much because they have been doing for decades what IWIR has formalized as an institution now. Personally speaking, Professor Raja Mohan, under his directorship of the Carnegie Institute in New Delhi when it was being set up, had given me an opportunity as a young emerging scholar to be in the field of IR. Professor Veena, Ravi Kumar, who is here, is both, who taught me the subject at LSR along with hundreds of other women during her 40 years of teaching career, and is of course a personal and professional mentor. And likewise with Ms. Heather as well, who on multiple occasions has visited LSR and inspired young women to participate in matters of national security and foreign affairs. So it's very historic to be kicking off this fantastic initiative with this panel, and of course Jasmine's extraordinary moderation, which I keenly look forward to. So thank you, Jasmine, and I'll head the floor back to you.
Thank you, Neha, and also for the very succinct but comprehensive introduction to the panel. But I think, again, before we formally get to the part, I'd like to just quickly discuss the format for today's webinar. So we'll kick it off with posing a few questions to our panelists, and that would cover approximately 40 to 50 minutes in the session. We'll then proceed to pick up audience questions. As really a mandatory housekeeping plug-in, I would request all our attendees to keep their lines on mute, and of course their videos off. We are live streaming this particular event on Facebook. Finally, the Q&A questions, the Q&A question box is to the right side of your Zoom screens and would be enabled, say, about 30 minutes into the session. So please do leverage the chat box to ask your questions, and we shall pick up on those. So with this out of the way now, I am delighted and honored to present to you a distinguished panel. So we have with us, we will shortly be having with us Ms. Suhasini Heather. As some of you may already know, she is the diplomatic editor of The Hindu, which is one of India's oldest and most respected national dailies, regularly writing on foreign policy issues. Prior to this, Heather was a foreign affairs editor and the primetime anchor for India's 24-hour news, English news channel, CNN IBN. In 2005 and 2014, she presented the signature show Worldview with Suhasini Heather, and prior to that was the correspondent for CNN International's New Delhi bureau. In 2015, she was also the recipient of the most prestigious Indian Print Journalism Prem Bhatia Award and has won a series of awards for her work in television as well. Over the course of her 20-year reporting career, Ms. Heather has covered the most challenging stories and conflicts from the most diverse regions, including Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Libya, Lebanon, and Syria. So thank you very much, Ms. Heather, for joining us today. Moving on, we also have Professor Raja Mohan with us. He is a director at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. Prior to that, he was also a professor of South Asian Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He's also been a member of India's National Security Advisory Board and served as a diplomatic editor and Washington correspondent for the national daily Hindu. Professor Mohan was the founding director of Carnegie India, pretty much to what Neha mentioned earlier. So thank you again, Professor Mohan, for joining us. I'd also like to introduce Professor Veena Kumar. Her latest engagement was as an associate professor and the head of department for political science at Lady Shri Ram College, University of Delhi. Professor Kumar's publications and presentations cover a wide gamut of research in international relations, including security studies and foreign policy, focusing on South Asia. She is also a member with the United Service Institute, New Delhi, the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, Delhi, the India International Center in New Delhi, and also the European Association on South Asian Studies. Thank you, Professor Kumar, for joining us today. And finally, last but not the least, we also have Neha Devan, who is a non-resident fellow and political affairs officer at Global Policy Insight. She is also co-chairing the IWIR initiative with me at GPI. In addition to that, she heads the Commonwealth Project and Artificial Intelligence and Public Policy Program. She's also a consultant at the UNESCO New Delhi Cluster Office covering South Asia, including India, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Maldives, and Nepal. She's also a non-resident fellow at Trends Research Advisory in Abu Dhabi. Neha has also worked and served as a research fellow for Dr. Shri, who is a member of Parliament for India, and has worked with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And the final part to her very diverse kitty is her stint with the United Nations Information Center for India and Bhutan, amongst other countries. Thank you, Neha, for joining us today. I see Ms. Heather has joined us. Welcome to the session. I think we're about 12 minutes into the hour, so I'd really like to begin the discussion by first posing a question to each of you to really build the strong foundation of the remaining hour and 15 minutes. So I think I have this question as a common one for all of you. So it really revolves around what are some of the key challenges and headwinds that face India in the South Asian region, and what are the options in India's diplomatic toolbox? I'm wondering, Ms. Heather, if you'd like to jump in with this specific question first.
Sure. Thanks so much. Thank you, for Jasmine, for that very kind introduction. The interesting thing is that you have put these two ideas together, the future of South Asia, as well as the current India-China conflict. Because maybe for years, the idea was that essentially India, this was India's region of influence, if you like, its sphere of influence. And the conflict with China was something India dealt with separately. Today, if nothing else, South Asia is one of the main fault lines, if I may say so, between India and China. If you were to look at the bilateral problems, issues the two countries have, at the line of actual control in terms of other bilateral issues, if you were to look at the Indo-Pacific, which is the new frontier between the two countries, the idea that India will be a part of other countries, more like-minded countries in a kind of maritime coalition, then you have the frontier that is right at India's doorstep, which was once India's sphere of influence. And that wasn't very long ago. You know, I think ORF, the Observer Research Foundation, had come out with a study that essentially said, you know, in 2014 or 2013, they had looked at figures for trade as well as investment in terms of comparing India and China in the South Asian region. And in fact, what they ended up finding was that if in 2013, India was ahead of China in terms of trade with these countries, in terms of investment in these countries, in nearly every country, obviously Pakistan was an exception, by 2020, it was in reverse. And today, in terms of trade, India actually has less trade than China does with its South Asian neighbors, with the exception of the landlocked countries of Afghanistan, Nepal, and Bhutan. And in terms of investment, is actually it's really Bhutan that is the outlier. We're looking at that shift. It's happening. It's near complete, and that is something that is one of the challenges you asked about that India faces. The second challenge is certainly one which is much more serious, but it's still in its nascent stage, and that is the strategic challenge. Obviously, for years, India has known that Pakistan remains one of its challenges when it comes to China, simply because of the close China-Pakistan relationship. And in terms of strategic ties between the two countries. Today, we're looking at strategic issues with a country like Nepal as well. Clearly, this is not beyond repair, and this is something that can be worked on, but it has become a new challenge India had not thought about. The fact that Nepal is today considering making its borders more permanent, closing the open borders, putting more perhaps security forces on the border between India and Nepal. These are things of concern, because what if it happens to yet another neighbor of India? The third challenge is the connectivity challenge. Today, except for Bhutan, every member of the SAARC is a member of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And seeks to benefit from China's plan for infrastructure projects there. So in terms of connectivity, every country except India and Bhutan in this subcontinent is connecting up, even things that were thought impossible in the past. It was thought impossible in the past that Bangladesh could benefit more from Chinese connectivity projects than from Indian ones. But we now see Chinese railways, we see Chinese ports, we see other Chinese infrastructure in the country in terms of energy as well. And we also now see it in Afghanistan. In terms of the Maldives, India has been able to fight back a bit. And in fact, the new project announced by India just a day ago in the Maldives will actually, the Greater Connectivity Project for Mali will actually be the most visible, the biggest civilian infrastructure project there, even outshining China's Friendship Bridge. So none of this is a done deal. All of it is a work in progress. And India certainly has many natural advantages in its South Asian region. However, it is unmistakable that there is a trend that has favored China in the last few years. And that, if you ask me, is the biggest challenge India's dealing with today.
Right, absolutely. Definitely around, India's sphere of influence has been gradually on the decline. And you're right that it's not all lost and there may be some hope. But yes, there's a lot to work on. I think I'd like to bring in Professor Raja Mohan on your thoughts around challenges in India.
I would say three major challenges that face India today. The first and the most important, I believe, is the consequences of the corona crisis that have severe effect on Indian economy. Massive contraction, and there is very little likelihood that we will quickly get back to the growth path that we've had. Also, the ambition of making India into a 5 trillion economy, which was supposed to have been done. Even when it was announced, it was an ambitious one. And today, I think there's no question we will get there. And the internal disruption that it has created and dealing with it is the biggest challenge. So reviving the economy is the real challenge. And without that, the rest of the diplomacy, etc., cannot really, succeed without economic growth being back of the problem. The second is the rest of the region too is facing economic problems because, before the corona crisis, except Pakistan, most of the region was doing reasonably well. Nepal, Bangladesh, even Sri Lanka, all were beginning to get onto a high growth path. Bangladesh was very special. They were among the top growth economies in the world. So everyone is going to be affected. And coupled with this is the India-China problem, which Suhasini referred to. But it's also a fact that India is not only having a political problem, but it's the retaliation has been in the economic domain. So decoupling, dissociating India from the Chinese economy is going to add to the challenge that India has. And it, of course, complicates the rest of the problem that you've been talking about, how the rest of the region deals with. The second issue is the Afghan peace process. We've had for nearly 20 years relative stability in Afghanistan. All bets are off whether the stability will continue if and when the current process ends up in a settlement. So historically, if you look at the last 40 years, the developments in Afghanistan have had a powerful impact on, promoting extremism, the emergence of religious extremism in all countries. And the violence that we've seen was really post 79. I mean, when Afghanistan saw all kinds of things happen, the Russian intervention, the American occupation. So the Afghanistan, I think we tend to underestimate its importance. And you add to that the current conflict in the Middle East. So together they have a powerful impact on a whole range of forces in South Asia. And I think dealing with that is going to be another problem. And lastly, the rise of China, which Suhasini again referred to, is really beginning to crack up South Asia. So I think the idea that there is something South Asia as a coherent entity was always a dream because the countries never really agreed on anything, especially India and Pakistan. The rise of China, I think, is going to fundamentally change the economic geography of South Asia. So as the second largest economy in the world. So it's not surprising all of India's neighbors have a very good economic relationship with China, because China is number 2, soon to be number 1. So I think it's logical that when China is so close to the subcontinent and its economic rise will have massive long-term structural consequences. So I think the region, as we have imagined it in the last 40, 50 years, because the South Asia as a term itself is fairly recent. I mean, it didn't exist before the 80s. So you have actually that conception is going to break down because of the China's rise and the India-China conflict, again, which Suhasini referred to. Toolbox in terms of what we can do. Now, we have to accept the reality. China is the number 2 economic power. It's going to be a big force. There's no point complaining about it. And I think what India needs to do is to do what it can, which is to expand trade, open up its borders within the means that it can. Suhasini again referred to the recent project assistance of $500 million in Maldives. So do more of that within India's constraints and limitations. But the most important thing is in India that grows, recovers its economy, opens its borders to the neighbors to the extent that it can, it will be good. And I think that's where India's economic reforms, which have been largely focused on attracting investment from the West, today, it must have a component that thinks about regional integration. I think that's what is the key for India, that if it plays to its natural geography, which is, geography is still with India, it is a politics that has prevented regional economic integration. And I think we have to keep finding even small ways. There have been some progress with Bangladesh. I think we need to do a lot more with other countries.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you for bringing in the point around the impact of COVID on India and the setback that it's had on the economy, because the basic aspect around either providing trade or developmental finance and assistance to the regional players or countries is self-sufficiency for India to begin with. So this is a very, very important link that you highlighted. Thank you for that. I think moving on, Professor Kumar, is how are your thoughts playing around the challenges that India faces in the region and some of the diplomatic options?
I of course agree with a lot of what Suhasini and Rajmohan said, but I'm going to take the poetic or the academic license to begin with something that Mahatma Gandhi said. In a gentle way, you can shake the world, is what he said. But I don't think we can do that any longer. Even Raj himself is a very great proponent of the realpolitik. And I think the realpolitik is that we are caught up with a very dire situation today. The pandemic, which should have us sharing more and going into health areas, mitigating unemployment, increasing productivity, is actually going the opposite direction right now, and which we'll have to regain our status in that. In terms of, there's a shrinking globalization. And it's globalization now is turning into a myth as such. So then you find that we'll have to, make a greater effort to come together with the other South Asian nations in this area and deal on productivity, on employment issues, on health issues, things like that, where we are also thought of as someone we can look forward to, okay? Look up to, rather, okay? And in this scenario, China emerges as a major challenge to India's foreign policy. From the inception of the nation state concept, there was a competitiveness between China and India. Even in systems, democracy, India, communist China, economy, mixed economy, India, communist China, leadership, there was a huge role to play where both Mao and Nehru wanted to really challenge the other nations, not just South Asian nations, but take on the leadership. Now, till 1962, it seemed to be a friendly enough relationship. And then, of course, India felt very betrayed by the crisis. But I think by the recent Galwan crisis, it has done much more. Borders, we know, have not been sorted out. Line of an actual control is in question. And in actuality, it always was. The run-up to this is the Wuhan relationship and the Mahabalipuram Connect, Wuhan Spirit, Mahabalipuram Connect. And therefore, we found that these were merely placating gestures. And they seemed to bide their time, really. And it was just to bide. And according to some, it was like a gauntlet thrown to the kind of gauntlet thrown to India in terms of, sorry, I think something wrong? Oh,
We can hear you.
am I seeing? Yeah. Can you see me?
Yes, absolutely.
No. Yeah, okay. So the gauntlet thrown as if to get India, taunt India. And some analysis is that China has had a very kind of a trained army, but they haven't been on ground. So this was kind of a thing of trying to get India to probably have an experimental thing as to how it'll work out, which is a horrible thing to think of. But China has been aggressive and very assertive in that and picked up the gauntlet. Negotiations are there diplomatically, they're there militarily and strategically, but tensions, altercations, confrontations will continue. And like the Foucault in Truth, there's another truth to this. Truth is China never wanted India as a peer and does not want it. And it will do its best to keep it down. So as Raj said, the reality is that we have to be able to negotiate within that space and try to get something on board with China. And therefore maybe the COVID pandemic, because China is being isolated by other countries, gives India a better handle. You know, India can assert itself and come in with the Europeans, with the Southeast Asians, with its own regional powers as such. And the pandemic is a shakedown of the global scenario. So the configuration as we see is moving from the west to the east, and India has a chance, good chance, to rethink, to increase its status, provided it rethinks its strategy also. Militarily, India seems to be okay for now, but needs to really make up for its strength. Diplomatically, India has to take something more onto the table. And of course, there's a joke which all of us know, and you must be knowing, that every ambassador, Indian ambassador to China, becomes the foreign secretary. So I think we should use them as human resources and get them to advise us as to how to deal with our major proponent just now, i.e. China. Economically, they both have mentioned that we have to have a sharper policy, say on migrant labor, opening of industries, decreasing unemployment, and boycotting Chinese goods, even though it's an emotional response, will only harm us. Just one or two figures I want to give you is electronics, we are dependent 45%, machinery 32%, auto parts 25%, pharmaceuticals 68%. So, you know, I mean, we really are in the lower kind of thing as such. So we are dependent on China, but we need an alternate sourcing. And that's where I said we have to start looking towards other countries. And I know multilateral forums are not working right now, but maybe if we looked at it and also tried to get our neighbors with us, today, SAARC is not the, today South Asian nations are not the same as in SAARC in 1985.
Right.
It's different. And therefore, we can do maybe without the formal structures, but an informal kind of coalition coming together and saying that what is it we as nation states within this region need. More, of course, regionalism, and then maybe make our way outwards. Slightly utopian in some matters, but a very practical thing also that we'll have to take on.
Right. So thank you for this perspective. It has definitely covered a variety of points. And, you know, it does sound pretty clear that India definitely needs to rethink its strategy and approach towards China, but more specifically also towards other SAARC and littoral countries in the South China Sea as well. But before we get into more of the specific questions, Neha, would you want to jump in with your with the few challenges that you may have identified?
Thank you, Jasmine. I'll try to do justice to that question after the three speakers I'm following. But if I may extend the poetic license that Professor Kumar took in, begin this answer with a Chinese parable, which is that one mountain cannot contain two tigers. And I think that's a very befitting exposition of how India and China both perceive South Asia, and as a result, how they construct their foreign relations within the region. And just taking a bit from what Ms. Heather pointed to as well, and Professor Mohan also mentioned, South Asia as a conceptual category is a very recent concept emerging from the 70s, but there is a legacy to South Asia, particularly which emerges from the competition of new nation states emerging post-independence, competing for regional influence, competing for Western influence, competing for salience and economic and trade ties, which has played in as a legacy in the construction of modern relationships within South Asia. And particularly, I think there is a lot of scope for India to decide how it chooses to leverage its legacy, because especially if you look at India, clearly it had a very clear geographical advantage since its independence, which was leveraged very well in the Nehruvian foreign policy, whereas Pakistan and others took to finding allies or siding with Western allies. And that played down in the, if you may call it, the Indira doctrine, where South Asia pretty much became a backyard for Indian foreign policy and politics, a bailiwick of India, if you may call it so. And just taking on from there, there was an attempt to redefine South Asia with its economic cooperation through riverine integration under Gujarat and the Gujarat doctrine. But then again, if you look at statistics today and World Bank reports, I think inter-regional trade within South Asia is remarkably low. It's among the lowest in the world at about 5.6%, even though we have the largest markets in the globe. And a lot of it has to do with how India positions itself in terms of an international, of the international system and in its own region. And lastly, just adding to Chinese involvement as well on that frontier, Chinese investment, again, as was pointed out earlier, has grown about exponentially. Back in about 2005, China would invest around $8 billion as an average. And if you compare it recently with 2018, Chinese investment has risen to $52 billion. And that is just a monetary aspect of that calculation. There is, of course, a lot of political participation and interest that China has also had, which features in the second challenge for India. And it's not just that China has, of course, it's been a problem on the border for over half a century. And the border that India has with China is one of the longest undemarcated border, with a very rough and difficult terrain to maintain, along with its own economic and geographical problems. But at the same time, the nature of the relationship with China has also changed massively. China is, of course, a lot more assertive, it's a lot more influential, and I think it's done a much better job than India in rallying its allies and maintaining its neighborhood relationships. And if you may call it so, that I think the salami slicing tactic that is being credited to China is proving very effective for China, because it keeps India on its toes. I think India emerged from the 60s in a nationalist discourse in terms of the Sino-India war, but China has actually used the border to its strategic advantage. And if you see, it's made strategic and very sharp ingresses into Chumar, Depsong Plains. The Doklam Plateau was a 73-day standoff, which honestly played to India's advantage only because of its allyship with Bhutan. And that the same cannot be said of the Galwan crisis, because Bangladesh has been surprisingly silent. And as Ms. Heather also pointed out, they've moved to amending their constitution and altering their national emblems in responding to territorial conflicts with India. And India has also lost a lot, because even when the Nepal crisis was emerging alongside Galwan, Nepal did reach out to India saying that we would like to take an initiative in resolving crisis, to which India and the South Bloc responded by saying, well, we'd wait for the COVID crisis to end. So clearly it showed to the neighbors that if there is an alternative, you might as well go for it, because India is still balancing out its priorities. But I think I'll leave it at that and let you take on to the next question. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Neha. I think it's very loud and clear that China has had a significant amount of development, not just from an economic standpoint, but also the interdependency that it has created with the rest of the world from an economic front leaves it in pretty much a commanding position. And unfortunately, India has not been able to catch up until now. So it definitely leaves India, I wouldn't say vulnerable, but certainly not in a sweet spot, with a lot of catch up to do. And I think, that kind of brings me to just one question from Ms. Heather. And this is really about the fact that, you've pointed out that India's sphere of influence within the South Asian region has, been on a downhill since pretty much 2013. But on a larger scale and more globally or more internationally, India has picked up on a lot more traction on account of a lot of leadership visits and FDIs that have come from the West. So of course, in this interplay between regional associations and regional relationships versus international, what would be your comments, or what would be your thoughts around pretty much India's grand strategy in terms of what is and what should be, and also the foreign policy that plays around it?
Well, let's be honest, India is also a work in progress. When we talk about how China is changing, and certainly has changed in the last decade, we also have to look at how India sees itself, how India sees its place on the world stage. And if we are going to be honest about this discussion, then we also have to see what are the things India has done that possibly have actually maybe lessened its influence in its closer region, as you were referring to. The fact is that today the world deals with three different phenomena. And those three different phenomena is, one, the rise of China, which is changing so much of how various countries, not just India, all of Europe, the US, so many other countries are changing how they see their future foreign policy strategy. And the rise of China is having that kind of impact. The second is the retrenchment of the United States. I would never actually talk about the decline of the US in any way, because I think it is not possible to write off such a major part of the world stage and its place in world history. But I do think that the US as it stands today, and this might change in November, is retrenching from the world in terms of where it used to occupy huge influence, whether it is pulling out of countries where it was involved in conflicts like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and all the rest, whether it is pulling out of multilateral agreements, the United Nations, pulling out of the UN Human Rights Council, pulling out of UNESCO, now out of WHO. And then whether it is the US's decision really to pull away from its alliances in terms of what it was prepared to do for allies like Germany, like NATO, Japan, South Korea, and what it is willing to do today. If you put all of those together, and then you have the third phenomenon, which is the rise of the alpha men. I mean, I don't know how better to put it, but the rise of populist leadership around the world, which is very purposefully putting its domestic policies ahead of that idea of the global concept. You are coming to a place where India too has to reconsider what are those foreign policy options and strategic sphere supposed to do. Now, when you ask me about the sphere of influence, I think each of these factors has played into where India has either excelled or in fact has not done as well when it comes to the South Asian region. When it comes to countries like Pakistan, increasingly like Nepal, we see India, or even in an Afghanistan that would have a Taliban regime at the top, we see India increasingly saying, you know, we can't do much here, so we are going to just step away. We no longer have any kind of relationship with Pakistan because we simply just can't seem to overcome their desire for cross-border terrorism and all the rest of that. We can't seem to talk to the Taliban because we see them as proxies for Pakistan, and we will only recognize the democratically elected structure in Afghanistan. We have not spoken to Nepal ever since they've done things we consider egregious. Today, of course, we saw the two prime ministers had a conversation over Independence Day. But our policy has been, in the last few years, a much more muscular policy. If you don't do what we want you to do, our response is going to be pretty tough. So there is that. As I said, in countries like the Maldives, in Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, India is looking for a different via media. And therefore, it has succeeded in all of those. So I think we are dealing with the rise of China, the retrenchment of the United States, because the US is essentially making space for other players in every region to come out, to have themselves heard. And then we are dealing with some of the problems that our neighbors seem to see with our own domestic policies. Particularly over the last year, there have been policies domestically like the Citizenship Amendment Act that directly affect countries like Afghanistan, like Bangladesh and Pakistan, of course. So we have to think about whether, what the balance over here is going to be. How do we make it better for the neighbors we actually care about in terms so that they don't feel insecure about our domestic policies. And the final thing I would say is the concept of this alpha men is something that the world is beginning to see the impact of. And I don't mean any one alpha man. To be honest, some years ago, there was a book put out called What is Populism? And it looked at 17 countries, none of which are the ones people talk about today, whether it's the US, UK, Brazil, India, and others. Actually, in those days, people were much more concerned about countries that were electing populist leaders like Hungary and other such countries. The fact is today we are dealing with these leaders. The overarching theme to a lot of their politics is a kind of xenophobia, anti-immigration, anti-globalization, and the kind of structures we see in their foreign policy, which, as I said, is increasingly being overtaken by domestic policy. As a result of that, we are looking at that as a world that is shrinking away from each other. And I don't want to sound too, sort of gloomy in this prognosis, but I think we are in a period where we have to consider what the impact of this particular third component that I was talking about is going to also have on foreign policy. Now, if you also see it in a microcosm in South Asia, countries in South Asia are seeing these leaders or they are reacting to this kind of leadership. I'd be happy to talk later about how you think we can emerge from it. But I do think that these three factors, the rise of China, the retrenchment of the US, and the increasing popularity of these alpha men is all contributing to the kind of changes we see here.
Right, this is fantastic in terms of sort of articulating the three main factors in terms of those moving elements and India's response to this and India's ability to work around this, because the fact is that India still, in spite of being the second populous country in the globally, it still does not necessarily have the economic clout in terms of when you look at GDP, and the fact still remains that India does favor, or if not openly, at least wishes to work far more with democracies like the US. So I think that is certainly also a catalyst to a lot of the debates and inhibitions from China. But I think, at this point, maybe I think it'll be really interesting to get your buy-in, Professor Mohan, on the fact that as we see that India in some way is inching closer towards the United States, and in your book Samudra Manthan, which was published back in 2012, you did touch upon the strategic importance of the Indian Ocean to India, of course. And in this current scenario between India inching closer to the US and the Quad security dialogue, right? Of course, in the major attempt to secure India's sea lines of communication, how do you think is this playing out with the Southeast Asian countries and also the littoral countries? Would you think that these littoral countries would be interested in favoring and having a favorable relationship with India as a sort of a regional hedge to China?
Look, I think, India certainly, compared to where it was with the United States, it certainly moved closer to the US. It does more things today. It has got the biggest economic relationship today with the US. It does more on the defense thing. But relative to what we do, on the defense, for example, Russia, if you saw our defense minister, the only place he traveled to was Moscow. So our dependence on Russia is still pretty large. There is new American equipment that you see flying in Ladakh, but the Russian weight in India's defense remains very important. So I think we, sitting in Delhi, we see this US relationship moving as something dramatic and that it might affect the Chinese calculation or the East Asian calculus. But the East Asia has lived with US treaty alliances. India is never going to be part of a treaty alliance, but if you look at US presence in East Asia, it's far more significant. It has treaty alliances with Japan, with Korea, South Korea. It's got a strong relationship with Taiwan. It's got Thailand and Philippines who are historic allies. So I think, if you step back and look at the region on its own, not from Delhi's perspective, that the US has been the rock of regional security order, whether for good or bad. Yep. And the Chinese were quite willing to live with that. So many in India, we think somehow Chinese get upset if India does things. But the Chinese have lived with US alliance with Japan, American troops in Japan, American troops in South Korea, American support for Taiwan. So that we, I think, tend to overstate. The Chinese have learned to deal with it, with formal treaty allies on their doorstep, with American military presence, American ships going up and down China's waters. So the Chinese and the Japanese and the Koreans have lived with this complexity. Today, most of the region is bipolar. A lot of them have military alliances with the US, but strong economic relationships with China. So the region is already bipolar in a fundamental sense. It is between US and China. Much of the region hopes somehow the US and China will stop fighting. Maybe Biden comes, things will all go back to hunky-dory. Then we can go back happily to enjoying the party of economic growth. US, China are on the same side. So that is what they're looking at now. They might see India coming and playing a bit of a role, but we're not the central player. What India can do is make a difference on the margins in East Asia. Work with partners bilaterally where we can, work with plurilaterally where we can. So India can make a difference for itself and for the region. So what the region is looking to India, maybe we can go and hold their hands a little bit, give diplomatic support on some of the issues they're looking for, and contribute to regional institutions. But I think that India is doing, but I don't think it's sufficient or significant in this region. Second, I think on trade, since India has pulled out of RCEP, the idea that India can be, an economic alternative to China, or it can contribute to balance, because most countries in the region said, please stay in RCEP because we want a balance with the Chinese. Having you inside is better than having you outside. But India took a political decision. They're out of it now. So I think we should not overstate what India can do in East Asia. What it can do is to strengthen since it's not going to be in a multilateral trade agreement, it has to strengthen bilateral trade relationships. We will see that if they can actually do it. Second, bilateral defense cooperation, where we can do, we should do. So I think we have a long way to go in East Asia, and that we tend to say, oh, India is the alternative to China, or India is counter to China, a lot of it is really in realm of fantasy. And the Chinese too. I mean, what they say in India is not what they say in East Asia. They want to deal with the Americans. They talk about a G2. They talk about arrangements with the Americans. So this idea somehow the American presence is fundamentally threatening to them in India, that's not the way they look at it, because they lived with it, they've dealt with it, they overcome it in some ways. Some of America's best military allies are today also the best economic partners for China. So I think the region is not very, very different from the kind of thing we have in the subcontinent. So I would say a modest role, a role that must walk on two legs, as economic. We need to do a lot more. Security, we do something, but not really more. We can do a lot more on the security.
Right. Now, this is extremely helpful in positioning India, of course, as the first priority is its own economic and social development, but then also the fact that its immediate South Asian relationship is certainly more, is of higher strategic priority than necessarily its sphere of influence in East Asia. I think maybe at this point, I'd like to introduce one question from our audience. So it's really touching upon, it's both for Ms. Heather and also for Professor Mohan, around the fact that you've touched upon to some extent on the muscular regional policy that Ms. Heather, that you touched upon, that India has demonstrated, but that does not necessarily seem to be incorporated in all of the negotiations that India has been able to kind of turn around in its favor. And how does that, eventually turn out in terms of the outcome of core negotiations with its immediate allies around the South Asian region?
Well, I mean, the truth is that how does India deal with China is a question on everybody's lips, right? Everyone is talking about what is the counter strategy. We all know what the problem is. We all know where China is today, what China is doing, what China intends to do to us. But we have not yet come up with a counter strategy, particularly as former NSA Shiv Shankar Menon said, a counter-continental strategy. Because remember, while we talk about the Quad and we talk about what India can do in the maritime sphere, eventually India's problem with China will always be, the first focus will always be a 3,500 kilometer line of actual control, a non-demarcated boundary between these two countries. And any flare-up along this LAC is always going to be something of concern to India. It is its continental strategy that we don't really know the answer to. The US can tie up with us and Australia and Japan in the Indo-Pacific. We can give China certainly a hard time and ensure that we keep those sea lanes open along with what they call the coalition of democracies. But at the end of the day, we are not going to see foreign troops come to save us at that line of actual control, nor do we wish it, nor I would say do our partners wish to do anything like that. So we are looking at a place where everybody will have an idea about how to deal with this Chinese threat, and particularly, as you are asking, the threat in that South Asian region. How does India counter China there? So I would say, and you mentioned the muscular policy versus an emotional policy, I think was a question from Abhishek. But the truth is that one of the ways to deal with it, and I'm not saying it's the only way, it's certainly not a very popular way today, is to be the un-China. That is, if China is working its way through the South Asian region with a certain set of advantages, then don't play China's game, because eventually you will end up playing catch up, and at the worst you will lose that game. So it's not about how much more money you can put into infrastructure projects. It's not as much about how much strength you can bring with these connectivity networks. It is about India's intrinsic strengths. What is that intrinsic strength? The ability to give countries what they need when they need it. And I think the Maldives plan is one such example of India working with a country to say, tell me what you need, I'll help you get it. without you having to take these big loans from China and without you having to go to the ADB and pulling yourself into an even more ambitious strategy and a more difficult and unsustainable loan to go back to. It is not just in terms of being the un-China when it comes to helping, it is also being the un-China in not believing in the power of muscle power. Again, I don't think this is a very popular sentiment today because the India that we see today is an India that is asserting itself in the region. When we have a problem with Pakistan, cross-border terrorism, we hit back. We send troops across the LOC. We bomb parts of Pakistan that are not even in disputed territories. We threaten to take back POK on a very regular basis. And then we had the entire strategy of doing away with 370 in Jammu and Kashmir. I don't want to go too much into that. I'm just saying that that's our answer. With Nepal, we don't like the constitution they put together. Suddenly there's a massive blockade. With the Maldives, with Sri Lanka, even with Nepal, when we don't like the leadership, we completely disengage. And then when they lose the elections, we make, we then move on with the next government. If they win the elections, the stasis continues. This is one way of dealing with countering China, but I would suggest it is not a very effective way for India, which lives in South Asia, regardless of whether you see this as a coalition, whether you see this as a coalesced region. So the opposite of muscle power might actually be a better solution, as we have seen with Bangladesh, as we have seen now with the Maldives, and even in terms of India's great popularity when it comes to Afghanistan. That all comes from not muscle power. And the third, I would say, is for India to be an example. You know, Joseph Nye said about soft power of a country, he said it isn't about who wins the war. It is about whose story wins. Which is the country that you most aspire to be? That's what explained America's power in the world. I would suggest that is what explains India's power in its region, where even if we had non-democratic countries in the region, those countries aspired to India's democracy. Those countries aspired to India's pluralism, even though they were majoritarian countries. Those countries aspired to India's ability to deal with diversity through dialogue and not through an idea of a one nation, one way of doing things, which seems to dominate the discourse today. So I would say if India was that example, this would help it being the un-China. I'll leave it there.
Yes, absolutely. An antidote to China, at the very least, is what India can position itself, especially after what we've seen with Sri Lanka and also a lot of the other African countries. Thank you very much for that. I think maybe we can take another question for Professor Mohan. I think there's a question around that's certainly a follow-up to what Ms. Heather mentioned around counter strategies. So, India is starting to develop a counter strategy around, string of flowers and engaging with Maldives and a few other countries. But the real question is how effective would these strategies ultimately play out over a period of time? We can definitely not deny that India does have a certain level of catch up. It certainly has its strong, its soft power as its strength, but it does have a high level of catch up to play in terms of economic support to a lot of the players. But long story short, just pretty much in a nutshell, how effective would you think that India's counter strategies around string of flowers would play out to be?
No, see, look, this in the Indian Ocean, at least, India starts with much bigger, has more advantages than China. It is the natural, it's a resident power. The Chinese had to come from very, very long distances to establish presence. They've certainly set up their first military base in Djibouti. They have a strong military partnership with Pakistan. They're developing dual use facilities in other places. And the Chinese economic power today has given them, opens doors from South Africa to the Gulf, to South Asia, to Southeast Asia. So I think there are some advantages, but geography is still with India. So the question for us is that how do we take advantage of that? I mean, that we've neglected the Indian Ocean for all these years. It's only in recent years that we've begun to engage our maritime neighbors, starting from the from 2000s till then, actually, we were so focused. I mean, we have a problem on both our land borders. So it is not surprising that we neglected the maritime side. It's only when India became a globalizing nation, that it became a trading nation, that we began to see the value of the seas. And we've seen some developments.
Yes.
For example, the recent developments in the Andaman. Forget doing things in other people's territories. Develop your own territories, which is what the Prime Minister was talking about today. You know, we had that it took us so long to set up internet, proper internet in Andaman. Tells you how deep the problem was. That today China has out of the top 10 ports in the world, they have 8 of them. India has 1 in the top 50. So I think we have, develop our own maritime infrastructure, do more trade with the neighbors. So I think India's trade certainly has improved in the last 30 years, ever since we've done reforms, but there is a long way to go. So I wouldn't, we shouldn't get too, thinking about China, that we got to do what we need to do, which is countries are looking in the Indian Ocean for military, economic, political cooperation with India, where we promised a lot, but we often find it difficult to deliver. So I would say within the region, across in Africa, in the Gulf, many countries would want to see India do more in the region. And unlike in East Asia, where you really can't be a player, which is a totally bipolar, in this part of the world, you have historic relationships with island states. You had historic relationships on the east coast of Africa. There's a lot we can do, but I think the Chinese have woken us up. I mean, there's no denying that, and that we are paying a lot more attention. But I would say more than the China factor, the fact that we are a trading nation today, which we were not before the 1990s, when we started our economic reform. India's trade actually shrunk. India became a non-trading nation post 47 to the 90s. But today, trade is almost 40% of India's total GDP. So I think there is today much stronger imperatives for India to engage. But on the military diplomacy side, we have not had institutional capacities. For example, Chinese are selling a J-21 everywhere. Because India neglected its domestic defense industrial base, yes, we have very little to offer. So, for example, one example, in Sri Lanka, the Chinese and the Pakistanis are telling them, look, take our JF-21, we'll give it to you for free, we'll train you, we'll develop your air force. India says, no, don't take it from them. But right now we don't have anything, maybe we'll give it to you something later. So we are constrained by the absence of domestic industry, defense base. And that's why today, when we talk about doing more in India, probably it take us 10 years, 15 years before you can develop some capability to export defense equipment. Indian Navy has been giving ships to our partners. For example, we gave some ships to Maldives, we gave some ships to Seychelles, but that's not a solution to having the ability to actually engage in serious military cooperation. We do a lot of exercises, but we have a long way to go before we can actually deliver arms, create special relationships of strengthening a defense diplomacy.
Right. Oh, absolutely. That is that's spot on. Absolutely spot on. I think there's one follow-up question we can take, just a short one, before we then have a sort of more focused discussion with Neha and Professor Kumar. But how do you think would the Malacca Strait dilemma turn out to be for China? It is, of course, a very important line of communication for China, and also the response with Andaman.
You're asking me?
Yes.
No, look, I think the Malacca dilemma is again hyped up. You see, look, there were blockades in the Second World War. We haven't seen, serious blockades. I mean, look, take a ship is going to crossing Malacca Straits.
Yes.
It's dumping half of its oil in China, another 1/3 in Korea, South Korea, another 1/3 in Japan. Are we going to blow up that ship? So this idea somehow we can do naval blockades of the kind that existed before. So again, I think is a stretch. So given the deep economic integration that has taken place, and that idea that we simply block that's what the Chinese use that argument to develop bases here. We use that argument to say, look, we need to strengthen. So I think, but that's part of it. If you cut through that argument, many of those, framings are actually questionable. That doesn't mean, look, India needs to do more. I mean, it must develop a stronger Navy that can operate. It can see where we can make a difference is to actually give assistance to smaller countries on maritime security. Most of the ASEAN countries want us to do more things providing maritime security, which is, from environmental management to the oceans to giving them capacity to develop their legal capacity to argue with the Chinese. There are a whole lot of things we can do. So blocking blockades and blowing up the Chinese ships in Malacca Straits is probably will come way down, if at all, and if ever.
Right, thank you. Yes, that's fantastic. Moving on to a slightly different segment, I'd say, in terms of focusing on, the security dilemma, right? Neha, you mentioned about that at the onset around, I think what could be interesting for us to understand is, India's positioning on managing the LAC, the extremely long LAC, and also any kind of potential future incursions that we could expect from China in untraditional ways, either on turf, in an economic perspective, or also sort of sea lines of communications, not just by China, but its proxies, right, in terms of satellite states like Pakistan to some extent. What would be your thoughts around that specific angle?
Thank you, Jasmine. And I have to be a traditionalist in this sense and divide up the discussion a little between the very hard security aspect, which takes up a large space because of the narrative around the muscular international policy that India has, and the other aspect about India's soft power and remanifesting it, particularly in the IOR. So just on the first aspect there, I think, as has been in this discussion as well, India's muscular international approach definitely did a lot better in being articulated in the rhetoric against Pakistan as opposed to China. Because as we saw, there was a lot of backlash from the population, from the civilian population, which hasn't been seen before in the case of other sort of rival states in the region. And that really put, I think, India's security elite in a fix. But that being said, I think it is also important to note that a lot of the security elite has been talking about a need to revitalize India's China policy, a new China policy. But honestly, back in 2011, when the Naresh Chandra committee was set up, they very presciently warned of China's growing threat. They did specifically said that there is a containment of India that is being done by a modernized PLA, and it is something that India should be wary of, and that there is a need to shift our security strategy from Islamabad to Beijing. But I think India's obsession with Pakistan to some extent prevents it from taking a larger perspective of its national security environment. And again, but however, I think in the last decade, India has done a lot on the LAC, particularly even if not to go out and wage a full-fledged war, but to project its actual offensive capabilities. Last October, they tested out the integrated battle groups, the very sophisticated 17 corps on the eastern front of the LAC. The all-powerful, as they say, the T-90 Bhishma tanks have been placed around the LAC. You'll find the C-17 Globemaster, Super Hercules, Chinook, all these capabilities that India pride itself on placed around or nearby the LAC. At the same time, there is a lot of focus on developing infrastructure and connectivity around some of India's highest airstrips to give it some sort of a strategic offensive advantage when it comes to China. And additionally, BrahMos, as a very symbolic gesture, also received its clearance in the midst of the India-China row. Overnight, the Ministry of Defense budgeted an investment of almost $5.5 billion to upgrade and procure more MiG-29s. So clearly there is a lot of movement to project a balance in the offense-defense mismatch between India and China. However, at the same time, if you look at China's policies, the PLA has been modernizing for a long time. And if you can even match up a combat on ground or hand-to-hand combat situation, there is the new aspect of electronic diplomatic warfare, technological warfare, where we are not sure if we're capable enough. Likewise, in the Indian Ocean region, we of course have had a God-gifted geographical advantage that we've tried to maintain. But at the same time, I think when Hu Jintao spoke of the Malacca dilemma over the Strait of Malacca, the Chinese position, Chinese energy position was also much different. And while we pestered on this theory of string of pearls surrounding India, China went ahead and actualized the BRI initiative, then turned it into an actual real threat for India. And even if you look at the naval capabilities, while we do have some highlights and milestones here and there, our naval frigates, our corvettes, even our patrolling vessels are almost half in number when you look at the Chinese ones which are there in the Indian Ocean region. So I think there is still a great mismatch there. And on the moment at Galvan and the LSA, it was not a black swan moment either. Of course, as has been mentioned in this discussion, it is very, very difficult to maintain such a difficult terrain, almost 4,000 kilometers long. But then again, I think India's preparedness should have taken into account China's aspirations much, much sooner than it did. I think speaking on the soft power perspective and also what can India really do, therefore, I think there is the conflict actually, if anything, comes at a great time for India, because India has tried to rally around the flag of its strategic autonomy. And the irony there is India is autonomous when it comes to competing with great powers, when competing with powers in the Security Council, but it is the strategic aspect which gets played out in South Asia, and it uses it to maintain a power asymmetry. And hence, with the Chinese alternative, a lot of the neighbors in South Asia have actually found a better partner. China has found an unconditional ally. Bangladesh has found itself, well, to some extent caught in a debt trap, but also in a maneuver which might benefit economically through China. But I think looking at what Dr. Jaishankar also says, and the norms strategy, the new orientation in a reformed multilateral system, that sort of an approach that won India 184 out of 192 votes for a non-permanent seat in the UN Security Council, it goes to show that India can project itself as a reliable yet rising actor in the multilateral system. It can be an assertive ally to middle and smaller powers, and therefore it's important that it uses the same approach in its own region as much as it does in the MENA region or the rest of the world. I think it is a good time for India to actually put some weight behind its strategic autonomy, to actually put an impetus behind projects like Project Sagar, and work on its bilateral agreements and commitments within the region if it actually wants to be a solid competitor with China. And lastly, I think it is important to realize, and Professor Kumar indicated this as well, that for the rest of the conflict watchers, mainly emerging from Europe or Washington, this is not just a conflict between two Asian great powers or the same tiger and dragon narrative. It is also a conflict between what an unrelenting Communist Party of China might look like, a party which is going and asserting power in Hong Kong, that is now taking up trade disputes with countries like Australia, that is domestically more vocal and also more vocal, particularly in responding to the COVID-19 crisis and all the retorts it's received. So what does that competition look like between a China with a Communist Party and a democracy that India is trying to still maintain and strive to be? And I think an important aspect there is for India to also remember that a strong foreign policy also begins at home, and it's probably better to make a few concessions across party lines than actually make concessions across border lines or beyond them. So I think that would be my take on that one. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Neha. I think that's a great takeaway in terms of sort of the doable compromises. I think I'd like to bring in Professor Kumar. You know, historically, India has had a sense of over expectation from China as more so a big brother approach, right? And despite the fact that China has never openly reciprocated that. And I think, you know, with the recent events, which Neha did highlight as something that are not black swan events in terms of, you know, Doklam and also in Galvan. But the big question is, what would you expect would change from here on? Because we've had two incidents within, in less than a 5-year span at the border, putting up front, pretty much up center that China's aggression is only going to increase. So how would you expect, from an academic perspective, of course, really the relationship with India and China to evolve from this point?
I think it's a difficult proposition because there's been so much bad blood recently. But a few points I want to take off on. Where India had the capability, for example, we were given the tender to go in for the port at Hambantota. We kind of cooled our heels, whereby China rushed into that, where we could have created a port area where we could have had economics. Economic major trade-offs with Sri Lanka, as well as reacted politically. So we've been lax in trying to get into spaces. But I also want to, again, reiterate my point that time is not lost, because Hong Kong does need help. Democracy and rights there. It's not just the United States, flag flying that could help Hong Kong. India can step into spaces, into cities. And also, for example, Taiwan's militarization is only being referred to by United States. I think even the US at this point would probably be more thankful if India also tried to step in. Plus, one or two other points from taking off from the previous speakers. We are going in for a major defense procurement. I don't really consider the Rafale, because there are only 3 in terms of, we really need about 32, I think. So to really make up for a force multiplier. But things are to be done, and we have to make a way through that. But one more point which becomes very important is the internal situation in China. None of us have addressed that. Xi Jinping is not very popular just now. There is a whole lot of dissent going on in the CPC. And where, of course, these are outside authors or dissidents who are likening him to Hitler. They're likening him to Napoleon Bonaparte. But apart from that also, the Chinese Communist Party comes out with a unanimous voice, but within themselves, they do have a part to, bring out their own arguments, which is not apparently happening. Mohan was one great example, and the people are not all that happy from all that's coming out from the Chinese. The other thing about Galwan is, I think our own generals, of course, there were the Gymkhana generals who protested, and they were being put in their place. But there were also people like General Panag and other people who had said that India needs a different kind of strategy. What happened in Galwan should not have. And India now can make use of its position in the Security Council. Maybe do a little more lobbying, which we're not willing to do or weren't willing to do. Again, of course, Jaishankar brings out something that we can't come into a situation and withdraw. Come in again and say, no, now we're not going to deal with this. Yeah. So I think we have to have a consistency of approach. I think that's a major foreign policy implication that we have to give. In the Galwan crisis, the government of India could have actually directed the narrative. Instead, I think we gave up pretty soon. And of course, the military commanders went into the conference. As I said, the diplomats also were trying to get to the table and try to bring out some kind of a peace thing in that. But for example, Nepal has been asking India to sit at the table and resolve some of the problems which we haven't done. Maybe, honestly speaking, we still had the big brother attitude. So I think we should give up on that. If you're thinking of the South Asian region, I think we should also try to do it in a different and a friendly way. I think Neha mentioned also a Gujarat doctrine. I don't mean exactly that, but I think the times have changed when India can't say, now we are sitting on this high horse and we'll come in whenever we want to. Consistency of foreign policy. not just gestures, but strategy. I think that's a major thing that we have to see to. Where China is concerned, the PLA has is financially not that sound. Trade-wise, China is, and it's trying to keep up that major degree. But I think in terms of India-China, we have to be able to negotiate better deals. And we went on over, I think, 3 to 4 decades saying Pakistan and more Pakistan. When I think we all realized, quite a few of us, that it was not Pakistan, but it was China, which was the important counter in India's, should have been the important counter in India's foreign policy. So I think very slowly, we have to make our way with Sri Lanka, with Nepal. Bhutan also is caught between. I think the geopolitics of this region keeps the smaller powers balancing between India and China. So just like we feel a lot of the times with the United States, I think we have to get the nations with us. We're the only country I know who has borders with 7 nations. So I think we have to use that and say, we want to be friends, but we'll be friends consistently. You know, it's not in and out and then take on a kind of a very Cautilian or Machiavellian, I'm using them, of course, very freely, but you know what I'm trying to say, kind of an approach to our neighbors. South Asia, of course, is nowhere near becoming this huge regional conglomerate, but I think we can slowly benefit ourselves, come through it, navigate problems, and then you have ideas of major security challenges, which a lot of you have brought out in terms of defense preparedness. That's something we have to do. And there is something that, 2 points which I definitely want to touch upon. And that is one, in this whole discussion, the ORF discussion in which Raj has been there, Suhasini's been there, and some other people, has not touched upon nuclearization. So I don't know, you know, I mean, whether we are still going in for it, whether we are looking at that as a, you know, any kind of a strategy. This is just throwing a point in. It's not really very well followed up. And the other point that I really want to make, where the ASEAN nations are concerned, attending some of their major delegations, I think terrorism became a very huge area between India and the ASEAN. So we can deal with that because there have been joint task forces, there have been memorandum of understanding, and not going into the Kashmir problem in this particular panel, there is the major issues that are coming up, of course, because of Article 370 and the kind of a lockdown in Kashmir. But we do have to negotiate that. So maybe choose the common problems and also work on them in order to resolve the bigger problems. And even with China, after 62 and beginning in the 80s, we had joint work committee meetings and tried to solve and upgrade more issues and kept the border issue at a side. Maybe we could do that with others also. And definitely with Nepal and Sri Lanka, we have to create some kind of bonhomie. Bangladesh, I was looking at the South Asian countries and their rankings, and I find there are some real surprise things which come up. Bangladesh has changed in so many ways. Pakistan has. India, in almost everything, was coming out first, in 1 or 2 issues coming out second. So I think we can have things which can be very workable, so to speak. I think I'll stop here.
Right, absolutely. No, you've definitely, you know, answered my follow-up question, which was really around how does you know, India leverage these emerging opportunities in light of COVID, and also with an aggressive China, but more so around how does India leverage the emerging opportunities to tilt the balance of power in its favor. So thank you for proactively touching upon it. I think I'd like to pose the same question, just pretty much as a point of closure, because we only have about 5 minutes left. But Neha, I think I'll go back to you in the reverse order with this specific question around, leveraging emerging opportunities to tilt the balance of power slowly and gradually in India's favor.
Thank you, Jasmine. I think a lot of what I said earlier fits in with that answer. I think India definitely is drastically different in its position from taking a NAM sort of alignment back in the day to going towards a more active norms approach, where it is trying to have a new orientation and a place for relative powers in the multilateral system. And I think like I said, foreign policy begins at home, and the two aspects India needs to look into is the historical wisdom, and not do a Trump-like thing where you wipe out your foreign policy history or your treaties and maneuvers and only try to project a new narrative that a particular government is trying to create. And I think that is A, particularly important, and B, I think for India to change this legacy of South Asia, which we all began the discussion with, to how it is going to be leveraged in the future of India is very important, because I think the crucial point is that while we have a panel discussion perhaps on the India-China conflict every other day, how relevant is India in Chinese discourse? And I think one of the key things that even Indian media spoke about after Galvan was that the Indian aspect, or the skirmish on Galvan, occupied a very small space in Chinese newspapers, in Chinese presence, whereas if you remember PCA judgment back in 2016, there would be whole pages in Indian newspapers about China's position on South China Sea. So it goes to show how clear China is in terms of its position, that it is there to stay. And India, the best bet for India, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, is to make sure that it balances its allies and really keep sustained partnerships in the region. Just to touch a little upon nuclearization, as Professor Kumar also mentioned it, I think the mismatch in nuclear capabilities is very much evident between India and China. And I think the nuclear range that China has is absolutely is not in comparison with what India can manifest, even if it tried to. So I think it's steering away from that debate as a very cautious discussion. And I think with China as well, as much as India is bolstering its own combat squadrons or capabilities, China has also expanded its military budget about by 85% in the last decade. So you know that it will be bolstering its own offensive capabilities while treating India as almost as an obstacle in its great power projection. So if India can do much, it is only to balance itself out and really try to get the look even beyond Washington at other middle powers and allies to balance out China. And I think I'll just leave it on a last note that clearly India is also not ready to back down, because just this morning there were several videos of soldiers flying out the Indian flag on the Pangong Tso. So if you do go ahead and take that sort of action, you will, I think, expect some sort of a response from the Chinese. But I think for that we'll have to wait for tomorrow and see how well our discussions fit in. But I think I'll close it on that one, Jasmine. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Professor Mohan, if you'd like to continue in terms of your concluding remarks.
I would just say three things, in terms of how do we change the balance of power. One, I think, we're talking about the 74th year of independence. It's also the 74th year of partition, and the tragedy of partition continues to unfold. While we can't overturn partition, we must transcend the problems that it has left with us, whether it is resolving boundary disputes, whether it's better sharing of the resources like the great two river systems of Indus and the Ganges. There are problems with Pakistan. This whole structure is jammed there. But where we can move, we have settled our boundary with Bangladesh. We've done it in the maritime side as well. I think we need to keep moving. How do we better manage the waters of Ganga and Brahmaputra? How do we resolve the fisheries dispute with Sri Lanka? These are not, massive disputes. Indian Armada sails every day from, on Indian side in Tamil Nadu coast entering the Sri Lankan waters. So you're really ruffling every day visibly the so-called the hegemony of India. These problems can be solved. And I think more you take off the lingering small disputes that have emerged over the last 75 years between India and the neighbors, that itself will contribute to a better taking advantage of our geographic proximity, the natural connectivity that actually exists. The second thing I would say is really we need to align with the nationalist sentiment in the rest of Asia. It's one thing for China to say, look, it is going to meddle in the waters of Natuna, which are 1,500 kilometers away from the nearest Chinese territory. Chinese say, oh, we got historic rights. So I think we need to extend support to countries like Indonesia. Look, just as we resent Americans interfering in our internal affairs, while Chinese, everyone in Asia fears the Chinese. Sometimes it's said, look, it's better to be feared than loved. But when it becomes too much of fear, people are willing to acquiesce in it in the near term because of the economic dependence on China. But there is resentment against this kind of hegemony which China is exercising. And my sense is that we need to put ourselves in tune with the other nationalist sentiments in Asia. So supporting the underdog in the rest of Asia is the surest way that you strengthen long-term partnerships. And finally, we have to do more with the other powers, especially with the US, with Europe, since you're in Europe, and sorry, I don't know, you're in UK. There's a lot India can do with Britain. I think India tends to underestimate the importance of Britain, which is the 5th largest or 6th largest economy still. There is the Commonwealth connection. There is supposed to be a new Britain that is trying to come back. So since all of you are based in UK, I would say the time has come for us to rediscover those kind of links that exist and rebuild. This was a natural organization of 55 countries where we can do a lot more with the British. So I would say India's relationship with US, Europe, and Japan remains underdeveloped in economic terms, while China's economic relationship with all of them is so much more expansive. So I think there is a long way to go. In fact, I believe City of London was almost sold to the Chinese some time ago. Yes. And the Chinese influence in Britain is so large, forget Bhutan. So I think there is, go back to rebuilding the economic relationships that come naturally to us with the Western world and with Asian countries and with British Commonwealth.
Right. Thank you. Yes, that's definitely a few very important cents in terms of call to actions. I think I'd like to finally progress to Ms. Heather on your final take on, of course, the avenues around South Asian regional diplomacy for India.
I'll agree with everyone who has spoken. Professor Rajamohan made a good case for the other relationships India must have. But because I know you're winding up, I want to just leave us with this thought. We so easily situate ourselves in history. We are so easily worked up about the grievances of the past, and yet we are unwilling to situate ourselves in our own geography. At the end of the day, the 8 countries of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, I know it's a dead word, SAARC, is where India is situated as a region. If India aspires to global leadership, if it aspires to Asian leadership, is it going to be easier to aspire to that leadership taking those countries, and yes, I include Pakistan in that, along with India, or is it going to be easier if India continues to be held down by its contradictions in that region? So I would say there are 3 reasons straight away. I think that the case for India's regional focus has to be made much more strongly. And by that I mean without exceptions in its region. The first is that the only way to counter countries like China that seek to use their hegemony in the region, that seek to use their bullying powers against us, is to be stronger in our own region. The second is that coronavirus is showing us that globalization is under threat, is under challenge. Localization or going into your own countries is really not an option, given that we have all learned the benefits of being able to interact with other countries, whether it comes to trade or having markets or cooperating on health or any of the others, and the social project as well. In which case, if globalization has become this kind of challenge, if localization would be very difficult, isn't regionalization, in a sense, the only sensible option? That we have to learn to do more than 5.5% of intra-regional trade in the South Asian region if we wish to go forward. And finally, our leverage at the multilateral stage, at the United Nations, places where we become voices for powers that are not perhaps as prominent as us, is all helped and strengthened if we are able to make a better case for ourselves in our own region, as I said, without exceptions. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Great food for thought in terms of, you know, regionalization and also leveraging our existing, you know, credits. So thank you very much, all of you. I think before I offer my concluding remarks and vote of thanks, Arpit, is there anything you'd like to jump in for?
Sure. Thanks, Jasmine. I think very quickly, I'll just thank all of the panelists for the great discussion. I mean, I was reminded of you know, a paper that I read by a professor of mine, echoing what Professor Rajamohan and Ms. Heather said, that you know, Jonathan Kirshner and Ravi Abdulal, these two professors of mine, they say that the structure of international trade does impact the national interest for a nation, and if we want to, you know, play a larger part, then we need to look at asserting ourselves more in the international trade sphere, and especially in the region, be trading a lot more, you know, with our neighbors. So completely on point over there. I think the idea behind this panel was also to launch the Indian Women and International Relations program. And I'd like to thank Suhasini and Professor Rajamohan, Professor Kumar to come together and give us the strength and give us the support to be the platform where we can amplify and showcase the voices of Indian women in international relations. Because already what we thought was that there's a dearth of Indian voices in international relations in general, and even amongst that set, the subset of Indian women whose voices are heard in international relations is still you know, quite small. And our effort is to keep building on this and you know, help in whatever way that we can to support this larger movement. So thank you so much, Suhasini. Thank you so much, Rajamohan and Veena and Neha for leading this initiative. And thanks to the audience from wherever you guys have joined in.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
Absolutely. Sorry, just as a last minute comment, I see, Professor Kumar, you did raise your hand. So if there were a few burning comments.
It just occurred to me, this new education policy has now said not to learn Mandarin. And here we are talking about trying to create better relations and things. So I just wanted to intervene with that. I think we're making a bad decision, because the more you know culturally and are able to use those tools, the soft power, be it, I think it'll be better. Sorry, I kind of forgot and then I wanted to intervene.
That's a very valid point and observation. And of course, it does influence a lot in terms of, you know, our policy in the years to come, and, you know, and also our positioning in the regional sense. So thank you. Again, thank you very much to our panelists, Ms. Heather, Professor Rajamohan, Professor Kumar, and Neha. I think we've engaged in a very, very you know, constructive discussion here. And also thank you to our very, very engaged audience. Unfortunately, we've not been able to take all questions, but if you can send us an email at info@globalpolicyinsights.org, we will revert to you on the unanswered questions. And also thank you again to the panelists for supporting our cause on the Indian Women in International Relations Forum. So with this, we'd like to sign off, and we hope that you have a good rest of the day, rest of the evening. Take care and please stay safe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jasmine, for moderating this discussion so well.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.